And then oh no, you don't go to church, brother.
No.
They said that they're giving us all in 95.
Well, that's nice.
No.
Yeah, they look like they're little.
Well, they fit.
Happy birthday.
Yeah, you do. I'm gonna try to stay ahead too.
So Seniors for Peace, November 2020.
It's gonna be a mix.
Oh. Starts reading.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, good. Yeah, it's still pretty warm outside.
Oh, yeah. 50 though, gosh.
Tomorrow, afternoon, we're gonna have that sleep and then the snow.
Oh, yes, the sleep though.
I was supposed to drive to Rhoades tomorrow afternoon, but I'm trying to get out of all that.
Yeah.
And of course, I can't.
Okay. Another minute, yeah.
How's the foot doing?
Say again?
How's the foot doing?
Well, this is a brace. And all of it has things like this.
Oh, boy.
Goes around and I have to watch because sometimes it comes loose and sticks on the carpet.
Yeah.
But these are,
Oh,
and so I tried very much to put a shoe on, and Sunday I wore a shoe. And my foot hurt so much that night because I had to screw it into the shoe, you know.
yeah. Some of those things take a long time, don't they?
When I got to stuff that's left over, and I could only find one slipper.
Oh,
You know, I moved.
oh, yeah.
I think it's 4 o'clock. As you can see, I initially made this presentation for Seniors for Peace between Columbus Day and Thanksgiving Day, and that is significant. But I also made it in a completely empty chapel. Brian Daniels was here recording it and put it on YouTube. So that's what you're getting, except that I have some important things to add. So we'll go ahead with this for now, and then I will add some things later. Good morning. I'm Jan Rhoades. Welcome to the November Seniors for Peace. Our topic is Indigenous peoples and the struggle for their rights. After centuries of abuse, Indigenous peoples have had important victories, but at a high cost, including the loss of life. Beginning in the 1400s, European nations invaded, conquered, and colonized nations that had territories that had been for centuries and centuries inhabited by Indigenous peoples. The motives were to gain territory, to appropriate resources, and to introduce Christianity. This was done without regard for cultures and tribal ways of life. Conquest and colonization took place in Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and the Americas. I will focus on the history of indigenous peoples in the Americas, to include the devastation of 6 centuries of conquest and colonization, and of developments today where indigenous peoples have struggled long and hard for significant victories. Today, we're between 2 national holidays celebrated based upon myths about the experiences of the original inhabitants of what today is the United States. On October 12th, we celebrated Columbus Day, celebrated despite the fact that it is only in a narrow European perspective that Columbus discovered the Americas, where millions of people and great civilizations already existed. Columbus captured and took indigenous people and marched them through the streets of Spain in chains, along with exotic birds. Many in the Americas reject celebrating him, saying that he represents a violent history of conquest and colonization, and that Columbus Day covers up a history of destruction of cultures, enslavement, and massacre of thousands and thousands of indigenous people. On October 12th this year, our nation's capital, along with 7 states and 130 cities, celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day, commemorating the history, cultures, and the contributions of our to our nation of the Native American population. Next week, we will celebrate Thanksgiving, another holiday that represents a painful period in the lives of Native Americans. This week, our children will be dressed up in costumes of pilgrims and Indians, perpetuating a telling of history that disregards the experiences and perspectives of Native Americans. The story of the first Thanksgiving goes beyond 1620, when the Wampanoag people taught the settlers to fish, to plant squash, corn, and beans, and enabling them to survive harsh winters. Many of the Wampanoag were converted to Christianity, replacing their culture with colonial ways and giving them European names. As the settlers moved westward, there were conflicts with tribes throughout southern New England. By 1675, the Wampanoags were nearly exterminated. About 400 survived. Among those who did not convert to Christianity, many Wampanoag were sold into slavery. Male captives sold to slave traders and transported to the West Indies. The colonists used the women and children as slaves or indentured servants in New England. Today, I will present some of the abuses of the peoples and lands, but I especially want to focus on the ways Native populations have pushed back and the victories they have achieved in protecting their people, their cultures, and the land, which is valued more by the Native people than any other inhabitants of this nation. When we talk about genocide of Native peoples by colonial governments, we refer to acts committed with the intent to destroy a racial or ethnic group, by killing members of the group, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, or forcibly transferring children to remove their culture and assimilate them into the dominant culture. All of these offenses have been committed to the indigenous peoples populations of the Americas. The history of actions of genocide in the US includes the Trail of Tears, the forced relocation from 1830 to 1850 of approximately 125,000 Native Americans of 5 tribes from their ancestral homelands in the southeastern states to west of the Mississippi, which had been designated as Indian country. The removals were carried out by government officials. Men, women, and children were driven on foot, suffering from exposure, disease, and starvation. Thousands died before reaching their designation. One of the best documented instances of genocide was the massacre of the Yokut people of Southern California. When California gained statehood in 1846, the governor armed militias and sanctioned the extermination of all indigenous people. In 27 years, the Yokut population dropped from 150,000 to 30,000. The Yokut people remaining in the valley were detained as savages. The forceful transfer of Native children began with the establishment of Native American boarding schools with the objective of assimilating Native American children and youth into Euro-American culture. The government paid religious orders to establish boarding schools where children were forced to give up much of their indigenous culture by not allowing them to speak their languages, cutting their hair, and replacing their names. They were separated from their parents and communities, and there are many documented cases of sexual, physical, and mental abuse. The United States made almost 500 treaties with Native Americans, often signed under duress or fraud, and all were changed, nullified, or broken. In the mid-1800s, the federal government established a system of Indian reservations, relocating people to lands to which they had no historical connection. Land that was supposed to be a gift from the government in exchange for some level of self-government and protection by the US government. In fact, they served to isolate and confine Native people. The reservation system is particularly relevant today during the coronavirus pandemic. Tribal communities have some of the highest levels of chronic health conditions and are among the most vulnerable to rapid and devastating spread of the coronavirus. They often live in remote areas where families live in small homes shared with elderly family members. Even today, some reservations do not have running water or electricity. When the pandemic struck, the White House initially recommended $0 for federal aid to tribes. When Congress passed a bill that included $8 billion for Indian country, the Treasury Secretary did not distribute the funds for 6 weeks. By then, reservations like the Navajo Nation had more coronavirus cases per capita than Wuhan had at the height of the pandemic in China. Another form of genocide is the imposition of measures intended to prevent births within the group. The Family Planning Services Act of 1970 called upon physicians to sterilize perhaps 25% of Native women of childbearing age. Many of these procedures were performed under duress or pressure, or without the women's knowledge or understanding. Following the mass sterilizations, Maria Sanchez, chief tribal judge of the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, was a founding member of an organization led by Native women whose advocacy resulted in the adoption of federal regulations offering women protections from unwanted sterilizations. Although Native Americans practiced self-governance long before the formation of the United States government, they faced centuries of struggle before acquiring full US citizenship and voting rights. Government officials believed they should be assimilated into America's mainstream culture before they became citizens and gained the right to vote. The Snyder Act of 1924 admitted Native Americans born in the US to full citizenship. Even with the passing of the Snyder Bill, many Native Americans were prevented from participating in elections because the Constitution left it up to the states to decide who has the right to vote. After passage of the 1924 Citizenship Bill, it took 40 years for all 50 states to allow Native Americans to vote. That would be 1964, the year that I first was eligible to vote. Now I want to move on to share some of the achievements of the Native peoples in the struggles for their rights. They have pushed back with demonstrations, activism, media publicity, advocacy for legislation, and court battles. In addition to protecting human rights, Native people have been among the primary advocates for protection of exploited land and water, which are sacred in their cultures. Elizabeth Petrovic, an American civil rights activist, worked for equality for Native Americans. In 1945, she was credited with advocacy that gained passage of the first Anti-Discrimination Act in the United States. Living in Juneau, she faced housing discrimination and bans on entry to public facilities. She lobbied the territorial legislature to pass, first of all, she petitioned the governor to ban no dogs and natives allowed. When the law was initially defeated, she presented an impassioned testimony with these words: "I would not have expected that I, barely out of savagery, would have to remind gentlemen with 5,000 years of recorded civilization behind them of our Bill of Rights." Two demonstrations brought attention to destruction of human life and land and water. The 1973 siege at Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation in the Black Hills lasted 71 days. The traditional people demanded more independence from the federal government, as well as honoring the 1868 Sioux Treaty, according to which the Black Hills of South Dakota belonged to the Sioux people. On the Pine Ridge Reservation, the chemicals used for mining operations were poisoning the water, making people sick, and babies were being born with birth defects. Federal marshals and the National Guard surrounded Wounded Knee protesters, cutting off roads, electricity, and food supplies. For the rest of that winter, the people inside Wounded Knee lived on minimal resources while they fought the armed aggression of federal forces. Daily heavy gunfire was issued back and forth between the two sides. The native people refused to give up, and the protest at Wounded Knee became a victory for the Oglala Sioux. In April 2016 began one of the greatest organizing efforts to protect land, human rights, and the future of this planet. Tribal citizens of the Standing Rock Lakota Nation founded a spirit camp along the proposed route of the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. This brought national and international attention to the environmental dangers of spills and the necessity to protect the Missouri River. The Standing Rock Lakota were joined by representatives of 200 other tribes and allies from around the world. Attempts to remove the protesters gained a great deal of media attention, but the government did not respond to demands for environmental impact studies. On February 7th, 2017, President Trump authorized the Army Corps of Engineers to end the environmental impact studies and allow the oil company to proceed construction. The pipeline was completed in 2017, but in July of 2020, a judge ordered that the pipeline be shut down and emptied of oil, pending further environmental review. This week, President Trump signed an executive order to auction to oil companies the rights of drilling in the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge. The exploration for oil is likely to disrupt the migration patterns of the caribou. The Gwich'in people of that area, who were originally nomadic people, have been moved into 15 small communities. They call themselves the caribou people, saying that the caribou are not just what they eat, but who they are. Caribou are in their stories and songs and the whole way they see the world. 70% of the protein diet of the Gwich'in people comes from caribou. Gwich'in people have been involved actively in protesting and lobbying against the possibility of drilling. Movements toward guaranteeing rights have also included advocacy for state and local and national legislation. Native Americans have been elected to Congress since 1871. 6 won seats in this fall's election. Significant legislation following the Citizenship Act of 1924 has included the 1968 Indian Civil Rights Act, providing specific protections that had not been adequately addressed in the Bill of Rights. The 1978 Religious Freedom Act protected access to sacred sites, repatriation of sacred objects held in museums, and freedom to worship through ceremonial and traditional rites. The Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978 requires that American Indian children be placed with extended families, members of the tribal community for foster care and adoption. Now I'll move on to the experiences of Latin America. Since the conquest and colonization of Latin America, some of you may know that I grew up in Ecuador, so the experience in Latin America is very close to my heart, and I proceeded with that. But I was asked by Liz today to really focus on North America, particularly on the United States and Elizabeth Petrovic. Since this time, I I have a few things to add. One is that my 10-year-old granddaughter, Ruby, phoned me one day to ask about her Rhoades ancestors. I think what she was really asking was, as she was studying in school about slavery, whether any of her Rhoades ancestors were enslavers. As far as I know, that is not the case. However, I have a thick Rhoades genealogy that goes way beyond who begat whom and who begat whom. My aunt found stories about the Rhoadeses way back, and the Rhoadeses initially were in Pennsylvania and gradually moved west. I found in that the story of Heinrich Rhoades, who purchased a fort and 30 acres from the Oleo Indians, and the Indians left bloodlessly. Now, this sounds a little to me like the treaties under duress. If you're expecting bloodshed, is this a sale? That is a question in my mind. The other thing that I want to share is something that some of you are very well aware of, and that is that White's Institute here in Wabash County has on its grounds graves of Native American children. That means that White's Institute, that was established by Josiah White, a Quaker, was one of the schools that the government paid. And we talk about religious orders and very often think about Catholic schools. White's Institute, a Quaker school, was also an Indian school. And the fact that there are graves of Native children on that property suggests that those children had been removed from their families, that their families had not been informed or would not have the opportunity to take them home and bury them according to their own religious traditions. Those are some of the things that are very close to home for all of us, and certainly my Rhoades genealogy, my Rhoades ancestors. The other thing that I want to share, and Dean's going to have a photo of this, the most recent victory for Native Americans is the appointment of Deb Holland as Secretary of Interior. Deb is a member of the Laguna Pueblo, and the Secretary of Interior position includes Indian Affairs, Land Management, and the National Park Service. I believe that we're going to see some very important changes in the ways that they are managed, and that the Native American people on reservations are respected, and their rights are respected. That's all. Thank you. Lois, can you repeat your question?
What are the ways that you believe changes will be made with her appointment?
One of the things that has been suggested is that the national parks be in more ways controlled by the Native Americans, because national parks, actually, former President Trump opened up national parks to different kinds of exploration. He actually, the Bear Mountain, I'm not sure what it is, National Park, I think was no longer made a national park. So I believe that we're going to see, because those are the kinds of decisions that can be made in the Department of Interior. And I believe that we're going to see changes. And then, of course, the other areas of land management. And we're talking about some of the ways, as I said, the Native Americans value and have protected for centuries the lands, the resources of this nation. And I believe that the Department of Interior is going to not only make policies, but also enforce policies that have been there and have been ignored for many years. So those are some of my hopes for Deb Holland. Not to mention a sense of pride for the Native American community. Other questions or comments? Thank you.
For the